Technology is everywhere, and so should a systematic philosophical reflection on technology. The Working Group on Philosophy of Technology, WGPT, at the University of Leuven in Belgium aims to create a platform to do precisely that. You're listening to WGPTalks, a series where we give the opportunity to our own members to talk about what fascinates them at the crossroads of technology and society. Today we talk with Fabio Tollon on virtue ethics and emerging technologies. Today we are here with Fabio Tollon, who is a visiting member at our working group. He's a doctoral candidate at Bielefeld University in the Department of Philosophy, also linked to the Stellenbosch University, and he is mainly interested in questions of agency, responsibility, etc. in the context of AI. So let me just start with that question. Very simply, your PhD, what is it about?
So the project started, at least I was interested in questions of agency and responsibility in relation to AI systems. And the intuition was something like these systems represent a kind of threat, perhaps, to our moral concepts. And the idea was to see whether this threat would undermine or merely complicate our moral concepts. So the first part of my dissertation focuses on figuring out whether indeed moral responsibility, moral agency, or moral standing are threatened by emerging technologies such as AI. And basically I try and argue that while these technologies certainly are a threat or something to be worried about, morally speaking, I don't think that they undermine our moral concepts. However, I think they raise interesting moral questions. So then the way we evaluate these technologies shifts from trying to understand whether they influence a concept like moral agency, for example, so whether a self-driving car is or is not a moral agent, to questions of considering from a broader social perspective how these technologies can be implemented in a way where we can ensure morally desirable results. So I see this as shifting the burden of proof from sort of conceptual analysis to a more strictly normative framework, which I think dovetails then, or why at least the dissertation has moved from this kind of conceptual analysis to an emphasis on more sort of normative, strictly normative approaches, such as virtue ethics.
But what is virtue ethics?
That's a good question. It's difficult to say what is or is not put under the umbrella of virtue ethics. It's quite a broad term, but as I use it in the text, and I think just for the sake of having a discussion about this, I draw on the sort of Aristotelian idea of virtue ethics. And of course you have something like Buddhist ethics or even Confucian ethics. You could construe them as being part of the virtue tradition. But the virtue ethics that I work with is kind of the Aristotelian one, which focuses on sort of stable character traits that individual agents possess. And basically says that these things that we call virtues or vices, construed as stable character traits, those are the things that we should use when making a moral assessment of a person's action. In a sense, virtue ethics is the normative theory which says how we evaluate what is right action or a morally appropriate action is in terms of stable character traits, which are the virtues like honesty, transparency, things like that.
And you want to apply these virtue ethics to these new, you called it already, emerging technologies like AI. What is so specific about these emerging technologies that we indeed need to raise these ethical questions in a different way, or that we have to look for what the proper ethical approach is?
Yeah, I think that's something that even in my own work is a bit underspecified, which is precisely this idea of what counts as an emerging technology. I myself am not entirely clear when, how do we draw that line? Because indeed technologies are associated with a kind of moral panic often, and these are the ones that we then consider emerging in some sense, but very often other technologies might fly under the radar, and we don't realize that there were, a threat that was there or not.
What do you mean by moral panic?
So, for example, I think something like seatbelts. When seatbelts were first introduced, there was this moral, like, oh no, it's a threat, it's going to cause more harm than it's going to prevent. And this is a very sort of, I would say, banal kind of intervention, but it might have been construed in the public discourse as an emerging technology, even if really it wasn't that disruptive. But it was conceived by some to be disruptive. Getting a handle on what counts as an emerging technology is difficult, but for my purposes, the way I'm trying to conceive of emerging technologies is more from the perspective of their potential effects. So how they might be things that might be disruptive to sort of human relations with one another, but also to sort of the social constitution of how we sort of live in a day-to-day basis. So emerging in the sense of not quite fully understood and their impacts not quite fully understood, which I know may be a bit of a cop-out, but I think it is difficult to define.
But what is wrong with the classical ways to think ethically about these things? Why are they not sufficient?
Yeah, so I think that these, as you say, our other normative approaches are not as good as virtue ethics, I think, in the case of emerging technology. So I'm not saying, virtue ethics is somehow the best, all things considered, but I think it's the most promising in the case of emerging technology. So the other two theories that I think are the most sort of popular would be deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. So I guess what I'll do now, I'll run through the problems with consequentialist and deontological ethics, and then perhaps we can talk about why virtue ethics is superior. In brief, deontological ethics is concerned with the autonomy of persons and sort of moral reason as central figures. The most famous deontologist is Immanuel Kant, who had his categorical imperative and attempted to sort of justify what a moral theory should look like sort of a priori. So independently of experience, he believed that there was something like moral reason that we could use in order to figure out what was right or wrong. Now, the core idea that I work with from this kind of theory is that it claims that there are fixed moral rules that we can figure out independently of experience. And to me, that is the central tension, or that's the thing that comes into tension with something like emerging technology, where we're precisely here dealing with something where we don't have a grasp on the a priori concepts that we would need to use in this moral reasoning. So I think a deficiency there is that in order to get a handle on these emerging technologies, we actually need evidence and contexts, and we need sort of a practical evaluation. And I don't think that deontological ethics provides us with any sort of normative maneuverability to get a handle on those practical contexts. So, for example, you have something like the categorical imperative, which might be formulated as never treat a human being merely as a means to an end. Right, and obviously the merely there is important. So, you can use a landscaper to improve your garden, but you shouldn't merely use people for your own ends. In that case, that rule has to be made universal, right? And one of the key conditions of that universalizing process is that it's applicable in all contexts. Again, that's where I see the tension for deontological ethics, in that this rule-based approach that excludes context in principle might have a bit of a problem for emerging technologies, where context is so important in understanding the technology in the first place.
And in what way is the context more important with emerging technologies than with older technologies like gardening or television or simple tool like a hammer?
Yeah, I think that the philosopher of technology's famous example of the hammer is always good. I do think that it might be the case that indeed deontological ethics is also insufficient for so-called normal technologies, precisely because technology is not this monolithic thing that we can point to. We can't say, there is technology. There is always a context in which a technology is embedded, and it's in that sort of interaction with human beings and technology, and even how technology mediates our experience of the world, that we can't really divorce contexts from technology. So indeed, it might be a more sort of fundamental objection to deontological ethics, but because I want to limit what I'm saying to emerging technologies, and I think trying to show how this context is important sort of all the way down, my intuition say, yeah, that might be true. I think that's quite a difficult argument.
So the ontology is too rigid. What about then the alternative?
So I think there's a key. There's a certain similarity between deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics, in that both kind of do have a fetish for rules, right? So in the deontological sense, it's about moral rules, and in the consequentialist case, it's about figuring out how we are to measure consequences, right? That's the key. So you might have different variations of consequentialism, but all variations seem to say something like, what matters morally are consequences, That's the first claim. Then the second claim would be something like consequences should be conceived as X. So pleasurable mental states, or the satisfaction of desires, or preference satisfaction. So you get different variations of consequentialism, which sort of each have their own unique account, I think, of what counts as intrinsic value. But in each case, there is sort of one thing that does a lot of the heavy lifting. So I think it has a similar problem in that it doesn't really allow us, especially in the case of emerging technology, where the effects might be unpredictable. It's difficult to know what the consequences are in the first place. But I don't think that objection is too damning. What I would say, or something that I think consequentialist theories struggle with in the case of emerging technology, is how they go about explaining our interaction with the technology. Most consequentialist theories focus on mental states, naturally, because it's about who the consequences matter for, which is usually for sentient beings, and whether they can experience pain or pleasure. And the result of that is, when attempting to understand, say, how users experience an online platform, that experience is cashed out in whether they're enjoying, for example, they're enjoying the platform, whether they experience pleasure when using the platform. And the consequentialist might be satisfied with such an answer, right? Then we might say, well, then this technology is good. So something like Twitter. Someone sitting on Twitter for 10 minutes, they might self-report and say, yes, that was a pleasurable experience. And then we might be committed to say, well, then Twitter, in this case, is morally good. Right, it's a silly example, but you get the point. Mm-hmm. What I think that misses, though, is precisely the fact that people are sometimes wrong about whether that enjoyment should lead to a moral, any kind of moral appraisal of the situation, but also the fact that these technologies are engaged with repetitively, and it's precisely in the repetition or the repeated engagement with the technology that a new moral effect emerges. It's not just in the once-off study, it's in the repeated use of the technology which creates new moral habits, which might lead to different kinds of behavior, which might then lead an agent to say, all things considered, 2 years down the line, actually, while I did find it pleasurable for those 10 minutes, all things considered, I wish I hadn't done that. I think that was wrong, So this problem of how we measure the moral effects of technology, I think, is consequentialism gives us what looks like an easy way out. But I actually think that easy way out doesn't explain what's really going on in terms of moral habituation. And that's precisely where I think virtue ethics can come in.
We now see how both of them, consequentialism and deontology, have problems. But does virtue ethics fare better?
So I think the first sort of obvious thing would be to say that virtue ethics is very much concerned with practical wisdom, which is precisely this ability to reason well in a variety of contexts. So, the rule is not just always tell the truth. The rule is, tell the truth, or truth-telling is good, but there might be contexts which demand lying. The key point at which I think virtue ethics fares better than these two is this context sensitivity and this ability to really make context matter in our moral evaluation of situations. Concretely, what that means is that you do have to figure out, what kinds of things virtues are, whether they are stable, whether they're in fact these kind of these things that we can rely upon when making our moral judgments, because indeed the benefits of consequentialism and deontology is that they do give us these really nice, neat moral theories that have kind of nice a priori conditions that we can apply in a variety of contexts. And virtue ethics, by contrast, by incorporating context sort of into how it works, does lose some of that rigor. And that's where I think we might have problems in figuring out exactly whether these character traits are stable over time, but also figuring out whether virtues exist kind of in the first place, whether we can say that human beings do in fact possess virtues over and above sort of situational influences. So I think that virtue ethics fares better precisely because it can incorporate context into our moral reasoning.
In a certain sense, my intuition would be that virtue ethics is in a way ignoring context because it's about the person and not so much about the situation or about the consequence. It's really just what's happened in me. And so is then the advantage of virtue ethics in the case of emerging technologies, not precisely that it doesn't talk about these technologies, but only about ourselves. And in that sense, we do not make any kind of predictions about how these technologies will function.
The agent-centric focus, indeed, I mean, there is little room for context matters only in the sense that where the virtue is expressed. But the sort of the locus is still the agent who either has or doesn't have the virtue. So we seem to be stuck again in this situation of, well, context doesn't really matter in sort of the way that we might want it to matter. And one way to maybe amend the account a little bit is to say that where context matters in virtue ethics is in the sense that we learn to ask better questions about our technology. So instead of saying something like what the consequentialist would say, does this technology, enhance people's enjoyment, or does it increase happiness overall? Right, happiness is like this very basic notion. The virtue ethicist can ask questions like, does, for example, the use of Twitter encourage more patience? Are people more patient on Twitter? So in a way, it is agent-centric in that patience is a property of individual agents, but that property is always related to a context. So I think there is kind of a relational move we can make where we say how we specify the virtues always involves giving an account of the context in which we can expect them to be expressed, which I think the other theories don't kind of have room for that. So even if context isn't kind of foundational in a way that we might want it to be, I do think that having room for making clear what the context is and how we might expect a virtue to be expressed in that context seems good enough.
Yeah, so I interpret it as, in a sense, two advantages, right? In one way, it opens up the ethical landscape to have multiple things, not just this is good or bad, but it has this virtue like patience or this virtue like honesty. There are different things, you can all do good or bad. And then the other thing would be the virtue doesn't exist unless it is practiced, right? So you have to make it concrete, you have to link it to a specific context. That would then be what virtue ethics has to offer. And how does that help us to think about emerging technologies?
There's one example that I think is quite interesting with this, which is if we think about, for example, something like our treatment of social robots, right? So you have these, you say humanoid-looking robots. You've seen these videos of these Boston Dynamic robots that look like dogs, and they were testing how stable the dogs were. One of the engineers kicked the robot, and there was this public outcry online of people saying, well, this made them feel uncomfortable. Something about this seemed wrong to them, having what looked like a sentient, well, at least resembled something that we would consider a sentient creature, being kicked by a human. Something about that seemed wrong. Now, of course, on deontological and consequentialist theories, it's difficult to tease out what's going on there. But virtue ethics has a kind of nice response, right? Where you can say, well, we might say that this was a vicious act, even though no harm was done to a sentient being. This act reflects badly on the character, right, of the engineer. I don't think it necessarily does, but this is a way to explain the intuition without a deep sort of ontological commitment about the source of the harm. And that's why I think it's good for emerging tech, because it's precisely in this context of not having a clear handle on the ontological significance of the technology, yet observing behavior that we might want to construe as problematic or beneficial. And virtue ethics gives us a way to explain, I think, important intuitions, right? It's important that these intuitions can be explained because you need people to sort of be on board when you're trying to embed a technology. You want, the public interest matters. So I think the fact that virtue ethics gives us a way of explaining these kinds of things is in the case of emerging technology, I think it's really important and is a sort of a big improvement on the other two theories.
The example you give reminds me of the old argument about how to treat animals, right? Again, I think Thomas Aquinas is one of these figures who says the same thing about why shouldn't we kick our dog, not because the dog itself has necessarily any value or ontological status, but that it reflects bad on the person. And the classical ideas, and the child who mistreats animals will later become a psychopath or something like that. So in animal ethics that has been criticized precisely because it is very anthropocentric, right? But you seem to see that as a kind of, well, you could say a virtue of this example, in the sense that you don't want to delve into the ontological debates about the most extreme form would be robot rights or something like that. You want to leave that at the door, right?
Yeah, that's precisely what I think is good about this, in that, I mean, some might say this is a negative aspect of it, but I'm sort of motivated by more pragmatic kind of intuitions, and my sense is that a lot of this, especially things like robot rights, like that, these are important sort of areas of research, but when it comes to the questions that I'm interested in, I think there is scope to bracket them and to actually focus on these kind of more strictly normative issues. And this is just one example of where one could maybe make this kind of move. And indeed, it because it downplays, or it in a sense suggests that the moral worth of, say, the robotic dog is only indirect. It doesn't have sort of intrinsic or direct moral status. It could be read as somehow demeaning or demoting the status of the entity, but that's not necessarily the focus here, right? Because the focus here is on the agent who is doing the kicking, right? So the focus of at least the kind of virtue ethics I'm interested in is precisely looking at individual agents and how they might be reacting to technology, and how we then go about figuring out who or what is a moral patient, right? Who can be a receiver of moral concern, I think is obviously a linked question, but I think we don't need to do them both at the same time.
So it's a more perhaps pragmatic argument that we don't have to first solve the big issue whether robots have any kind of consciousness or personhood or something like that.
Yeah, we can still be vicious towards a robot even if a robot has no moral status. And that's an interesting conclusion, I think.
So virtue ethics all the way, but is virtue ethics without its own problems, or does it has its own problems to face? I can imagine that there are also criticisms of virtue ethical approaches, and that they apply here as well in the case of emerging technologies.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the strongest challenge to virtue ethics is precisely the challenge that says, well, in order for virtue ethics to work as a moral theory, then something like the virtues have to have predictive and explanatory power, right? So someone who is honest must reliably, in a variety of contexts, be honest, right? As simple as that. When we make the attribution, it must explain something about the agent. The problems, or at least the strongest version of the critique leveled against this, simply says that, in fact, situational influences trump dispositional ones. And all that means is that the virtues which we can construe as dispositions to reliably act in a certain way. So honesty means I will act honestly in a variety of contexts. That situational factors can explain our behavior more reliably. So that, ambient room temperature better accounts for honesty in humans than the actual virtue of honesty. And this, I think, many people are sort of familiar with this kind of work because it comes from social psychology and behavioral economics.
What would be an example of a case where it is indeed the situation and not the disposition that makes the outcome? So, in behavioral economics, you have, the kinds of studies that Kahneman did with System 1 and System 2 thinking, where people tend to, so with the availability heuristic, for example, people will, when evaluating evidence, they will evaluate sort of what they have available, what they've been recently exposed to, as opposed to an all things considered judgment. So the heuristic kicks in and they don't evaluate information properly. And that's a cognitive sort of heuristic, but the kinds of arguments from social psychology that advance against the situationist challenge are similar in that, but they focus on sort of a moral level. So one example of this might be that in one study, participants were asked to imagine an instance of sexism or racism. And then they were asked how they felt, like imagining this and how they would feel if they were in that situation. And participants across the board said, well, they would feel outraged and they would do something. The idea there is that they had an intuitive sense of justice and they saw something that was unjust and they said, well, they would intervene if they were to see this. And the same study then had sort of Confederates, and these Confederates played out the same examples that people were asked to imagine. So these now imaginary situations were played out in real life. And basically,
unfortunately, not many people actually intervened or did anything. So here you have a situation where you've varied the context and the virtue, right, whether we can construe imaginatively, call something like imaginative courage, you imagine that you would be courageous, whether we call it a virtue or not, I think is besides the point. What matters here is that changing the context influences, or in a sense, determines whether a virtue is expressed or not. So if people judge that, in the set where they're observing something that they believe to be unjust, they think the barrier to doing anything is too high, then they do not express that virtue. And that's a problem for accounts of virtue ethics, because it means that what's really doing the work is the context. So talk of virtues doesn't really give us much to work with.
And do you accept that argument?
I actually think there are a lot of examples from social psychology where you have situational influences really trumping dispositional ones. So I think it's an important argument for people who defend virtue ethics to take on board. But I don't think it does what it might intuitively seem it does. So what we might say is that, well, because we have all these situational influences, we need to give up the theory of virtue ethics. I think the opposite. So I think that a lot of these studies are empirically adequate, and I do think they demonstrate something real about human psychology. And I think it's precisely in that virtue ethics helps us, because the more we understand about context, the better we can actually inculcate virtue. So if you know, for example, that you have a sweet tooth, and if you go to the shop, you will reliably, you will buy a bunch of chocolate, and you won't be very happy with yourself. One way to mitigate against that would be perhaps to always have a meal before you go shopping, so that you're full. And that, I think, would reliably work in a variety of contexts. You might not be tempted in the same way. So I think what this challenge to virtue ethics does is it reveals something important about human psychology, but it also reveals how virtue ethics can help us, because it's precisely in understanding how these situational influences come to inform our behavior that we can really try to figure out how best to be the best versions of ourselves, right? So why I think these contextual factors matter is precisely because they can be used to think of ourselves not as merely consumers of context, but producers of context. So I think if you understand human beings to be merely consuming our context, then the situationist challenge is quite strong, right? Because then there's nothing we can do. But if you think of us as producing our context, which I think is true, especially in the philosophy of technology, where we're interested in how social systems interact with technological ones, then it becomes clear that what these studies suggest is we need to create better environments for our virtues to flourish. And it's good to have more work done in this regard, because then we can learn what the best ways to organize society might be to encourage expression of the virtues.
Let's make it really concrete. Let me just throw you an example of one of these emerging technologies, and let's see what we can do with virtue ethics. So take self-driving cars. A lot of debate on that, a lot of moral panic on that as well. What can virtue ethics tell us about self-driving cars?
The first thing that at least with my pragmatic intuitions, the nice thing that it does is it says, well, what we don't need to ask is whether self-driving cars are moral agents in their own right. And what we don't need to ask is whether they can be fully morally responsible. And a lot of the discourse on self-driving cars is sort of, I think, stuck in that kind of thinking. So we can immediately bracket that. And then we can start asking questions about how the embedding of self-driving cars sort of within our cities and our towns, how we can use that to either enhance virtue or reduce vice. So where I think self-driving cars are interesting in that I don't think it's immediately clear that they would be involved in virtuous or vicious situations, right? Because they would be there to be used by persons in a way where there's quite a clear distinction between the person and the technology. Whereas I think virtue ethics, really shines well when it's sort of there's a blurring between user and device. But one way that we can think through self-driving cars using virtue ethics is to think about the the ways in which self-driving cars might be embedded. So if you think about the US, where you have more, call it driver-centric styles of urban planning, cities don't have, many cities don't have car-free zones. Most cities have very wide roads. The cycling lanes are quite narrow. And so the preference is on drivers or vehicles. Whereas in most of continental Europe, you have urban planning that centers around pedestrians. You have wide cycling lanes, you have car-free zones in city centers, all of those kinds of things. And one thing that virtue ethics can allow us to do is it can allow us to compare these contexts and figure out, what kinds of virtues do we want, either pedestrians or users of cars, what kind of virtues do we want to be expressed in these contexts? And I would hope that the answer is something like, we would want respect for pedestrians, for example, to be something that we defend. And one way to do this then is to say, having self-driving cars that are embedded in a way that reduces the rights of pedestrians, right? So where roads go through places that might have heavy pedestrian traffic, that would be something that, would be morally undesirable. What virtue ethics could do for this kind of conversation is to figure out how exactly the embedding of self-driving cars might come to influence certain moral virtues, not just of pedestrians, but also the users of those self-driving cars. And it's, again, the whole point is it's difficult to know in advance. But one way to do it would be to look at people's perceptions of implementation of self-driving vehicles and whether this would encourage them to behave more responsibly in other aspects of their lives, reducing carbon emissions or things like that. But the point is, we can't know the answer from just looking at the technology. We have to look at where it will be embedded and the kinds of agents who will interact with it.
I have the impression that there are multiple ways in how our virtue ethics and technology can relate. One is, what kind of virtues do we have to possess and express towards certain technologies, like kicking the robot? The other one is more about how do new technologies challenge our virtues that we have? Do they inhibit them or do they stimulate them? And the other one, I'm not sure whether you would say that, so let that be my question. The example of the self-driving cars and the urban planning seem to suggest that not just individuals, but cities or societies can have virtues, right? In the sense of the way how you implement it is then, could you then say that a certain city has the virtue of being open towards pedestrians or something? Or is that purely metaphorical and doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I would be skeptical about the attribution of virtue to a city.
What about a group of people, a collective?
Yeah, see, I say I'd be skeptical, but I think attribution to groups, that can make sense and not just be merely metaphorical, right? I think it can be meaningful, precisely because what you're saying is something like the group has a reliable disposition to act in a certain way. And, you have things like collective responsibility, and, this is, we can hold things like corporations responsible. So why can't they have virtues? But I do think it's worth sort of keeping these two things separate. So even if we say that this collection, or perhaps even the city, has this virtue, it's worth specifying how exactly collectives have virtues and how exactly persons have virtues. Because we might find that these virtues would be defined differently. So, and this is an ongoing debate, right? In virtue ethics itself, it's whether we should have local virtues or global virtues, right? So something like honesty is a global virtue in that it's a universal. We all agree what honesty is, and we know when someone when we can attribute the virtue to someone or not. But it's unclear how it applies to more local levels. So, for example, you might have something like, so courage is maybe better. So you have this global virtue of courage, but then you have local virtues like courage in the face of courage in battle. So you have battlefield courage, but then you have courage in the face of injustice. And you might have all these variations of courage. And I think that at the individual level, you would find different local virtues than you would find at the collective level. And that might be one way to keep these two things apart, when we specify exactly what virtues we're interested in.
Okay, I learned a lot about virtue ethics, and I think I'm quite convinced that indeed it is at least an interesting way to think about technologies. Thank you very much, Fabio, for being here and for talking to me about that. I think we learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the rest of your stay here in Leuven with us, with the working group on philosophy of technology. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.